The noon sun stood merciless above the dry plains when Eleanor Hartwell stepped from the train, her white hair shimmering like pale thread teased loose from time itself. Heat rose in trembling waves from the wooden platform, wrapping around her ankles as if the land were testing whether she still had strength left to stand upon it. She gripped her small suitcase, knuckles trembling, the soft weight of her unborn child shifting beneath her ribs. The station was nearly empty, only a few travelers passing without noticing her at all, as though she were merely another forgotten scrap of the desert. Silas Boone climbed down behind her, boots hitting the boards with a hollow thud. He did not offer his hand, nor pretend courtesy. His eyes were narrow, twitching with the dread of a man who believed he had made a mistake too large to swallow. Eleanor sensed his restlessness gathering, like a horse ready to bolt at the scent of a storm. She waited for him to speak, but words slid from him only after a long, unkind silence. He muttered that he could not do it, could not marry a woman older than his own mother, could not show his face in town beside someone who carried a child at her age. He spoke of whispers, of shame, of neighbors who would laugh behind their doors. Eleanor listened with a stillness she had practiced for decades, because the world had always found it easier to judge her than know her. She only nodded, though something cracked inside her, quiet as a twig under the heel of a boot. Silas stepped back onto the train, just as the conductor called the final boarding. He did not look at her when he took his seat. The train lurched, wheels grinding over iron, and carried him away without slowing. Eleanor remained on the platform, unable to lift her gaze until the smoke faded into the horizon. She pressed her palm against the gentle curve of her belly, and whispered they would survive this, though she had no idea where she would go. Deputy Clay Timmons watched from the shade of the station roof, arms crossed, jaw tight. He said nothing, but judgment radiated from him like the dry heat. A few feet away, Old Man Reddick adjusted his gloves and gave her a single nod, the kind a man offers when he has witnessed cruelty, but cannot change it. Only Martha Briggs crossed the platform to hand her a tin cup of water, murmuring that the desert could be harsh on anyone, no matter their age. Eleanor thanked her with a voice that wavered despite her effort to steady it. As she drank, the air shifted. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, approached from the far end of the station where the path met the open desert. She turned her head slowly, expecting another bystander to stare or whisper. Instead she saw a man unlike any she had ever encountered. He walked barefoot on the hot boards, carrying a bundle of wood across a bare shoulder. His skin was bronzed by sun and wind, muscles calm beneath it, every movement measured as though he belonged to the rhythm of the land itself. Tawanez did not stare, nor squint at her with suspicion. He simply paused, taking in her posture, the tension in her shoulders, the faint tremble in her hand. His dark eyes held a depth that made her throat tighten, not from fear but from the strange sensation of being seen without being judged. She looked away first, for dignity's sake, though some quiet part of her wondered why his presence eased her heartbeat. He continued along the platform, passing within a few steps of her. The scent of cedar and dust followed him. He nodded once, respectful, and Eleanor felt the gesture settle over her like a gentle cloak. For a moment the world stilled, a thin strand of connection stretching between two strangers who had each carried a different kind of grief through the long years. Then he was gone, stepping into the sunlight with the silent assurance of a man who walked the earth on his own terms. Eleanor watched him disappear down the trail until the shimmer of heat swallowed him whole. She wished, foolishly, that she had spoken a word, even if only to ask his name. The platform grew quiet again. A vulture circled overhead, its shadow gliding across the dusty ground. Eleanor lowered herself onto a wooden bench, breath unsteady. She felt older than her years, though she clung fiercely to the fragile hope that had brought her here. Her child shifted faintly, reminding her she was not entirely alone. She whispered a promise to protect this small life, though she feared she had little left to offer. Wind stirred, lifting a few strands of her hair. The world seemed to exhale around her, as if acknowledging her defeat. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm her face. Yet beneath the warmth, something cold pressed against her ribs. The realization that she had nowhere to go, no one waiting, no plan except the stubborn refusal to collapse. When she opened her eyes, she saw the beaded charm lying beside her on the bench, something that had not been there before. Its threads were woven with delicate precision, colors shifting from earthy red to pale bone. Eleanor looked around, startled, but the platform held only silence. Tawa Nez was nowhere in sight, yet she knew it could have come from no other hand. She lifted the charm carefully, feeling its quiet strength. For the first time since Silas abandoned her, her breath steadied. And in that moment, a new fear rose, so sudden and sharp it felt like a warning. The desert around her seemed to watch, waiting for her next step, as if the land itself knew her life had begun to shift in a direction she could not yet name. The heat pressed close, heavy as an unseen hand urging her to move or break. The afternoon light softened into a gentler gold as Eleanor pushed herself upright from the bench, her legs unsteady but determined. The small beaded charm rested inside her palm like a borrowed heartbeat, warm from the sun, strangely comforting. She told herself it was only a trinket, a kind gesture from a passing stranger, nothing more. Yet it felt as though someone had placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered that she had not been completely abandoned. She breathed slowly, willing her strength to gather, though her ribs ached with every shallow inhale. The child within her shifted again, reminding her she had no choice but to keep moving. The platform was nearly empty now, save for the lonely creak of the sign that swung above the depot door. She tried to rise fully, gripping her suitcase with fingers that refused to obey. The heat pressed hard upon her, a heavy curtain that blurred her vision. She took one step, then another, until the world tilted sideways. She caught herself against the post, refusing to sink to her knees. Pride was sometimes the only thing that kept her upright. She repeated this truth like prayer. From the corner of her eye, she sensed movement. Soft footfalls, careful, measured, like someone approaching a wounded animal without stirring panic. She turned her head and saw Tawa Nez walking toward her again, though she had not heard him return. His presence seemed carved from quiet itself. The same bundle of wood hung from his shoulder, though his brow held a faint crease, as if he had noticed her struggle from afar and come back despite his own path calling him onward. He stopped before her without crowding her space, letting silence speak first. His gaze lowered, not to her belly out of curiosity, but to her trembling grip on the post. He reached for the gourd tied to his side and untied it, offering it with both hands. Eleanor hesitated, pride flaring again, but the dryness in her throat betrayed her. She took the water, careful not to touch his fingers, though her hand shook enough that their skin brushed for the briefest breath. It startled her how warm he was, how alive, how steady compared to the uncertain tremor in her own bones. When she returned the gourd, Tawa studied her face, not with pity, but with a kind of respectful concern. He spoke softly, his voice deep yet gentle, shaped by a rhythm she was unaccustomed to. He told her the heat could steal strength faster than hunger, faster than grief. His words held no judgment, no question demanding explanation. Only recognition. Eleanor wanted to look away, but his gaze held hers with a quiet pull, as though he saw the storm still rumbling inside her from the moment Silas left. She forced a small breath and said she would manage. She always had. She explained nothing else, yet the entire weight of her history hovered in the space between them. Tawa nodded as if he understood anyway, as if he had known many who carried sorrow alone out of stubbornness. He set his bundle of wood down and crouched so he could see her without towering over her. The gesture was unexpectedly considerate, almost tender. He rested his forearms on his knees and waited for her to steady herself. Eleanor felt the fragile edges of her resistance soften. She told him she had traveled far, that the journey had taken more from her than she expected. She didn't speak of Silas, nor the humiliation, nor the longing for safety that she feared she no longer deserved. Still, something in Tawa's posture made her think he already sensed the shape of her unspoken story. He nodded again, this time slower, the corners of his mouth tightening with a sadness that wasn't his but felt familiar to him. He lifted a small leather pouch from his belt and poured a thin powder into his palm. He told her it came from ground yucca root, meant to cool the mouth and ease dizziness. He offered it carefully. Eleanor stared at the powder, hesitating again. She had been taught to fear strangers, especially those who walked paths different from her own. Yet she felt no danger from him, only a strange calm that had settled around her like shade in the heat. She placed a bit of the powder on her tongue. The bitterness melted into a clean, earthy coolness. Her pulse steadied. Tawa stood slowly, retrieving his wood yet lingering. He told her he was headed toward his tribe's camp farther across the valley, that he stopped at the station only to trade for salt. He mentioned, almost quietly, that he traveled alone now because his wife and unborn child had been taken by sickness 2 winters past. The words hung heavy in the warm air, laden with a grief Eleanor recognized intimately. She softened further, not from pity but from the ache of shared loneliness. She murmured that she was sorry. Tawa nodded once, his expression unreadable, though his eyes flickered with a memory too deep to name. She shifted her weight, trying to straighten, but a wave of exhaustion pulled through her again. Tawa reached out instinctively, his hand hovering near her elbow but not touching unless she allowed it. She steadied herself without his support, though it took effort. He did not push. Instead he stepped back, giving her space, as if he knew she needed to feel capable before anything else. The sun dipped lower, softening its harsh edge. Eleanor found her breath easier, her pulse no longer racing. She glanced once more at the beaded charm in her hand. Tawa followed her gaze and said gently that it was for protection, made by his late wife's sister. He had left it for her because the wind had carried a whisper that she was alone. She felt something inside her shift, a quiet crack widening where light could seep through. No one had offered her protection in many years. Tawa lifted his bundle again, stepping back into the open dust. But before he turned away, he studied her one last time, as though committing her to memory. He told her the path ahead would be cooler soon, that she should not remain at the station when the night winds rose. Eleanor nodded, though she had no idea where she would go. Tawa's eyes softened, the faintest crease forming as though he sensed this unspoken truth too. He turned and walked away, footsteps whispering across the earth. Eleanor watched him until he grew small in the shimmering distance. She felt stronger than she had an hour ago, yet danger circled her like a vulture. Quiet, patient, waiting for her misstep. And just as she gathered her things, ready to attempt the road despite her uncertainty, her stomach tightened sharply, a deep pull that stole her breath. It was not quite pain, but something close, something new, something that hinted her journey might soon become far more precarious than she imagined. Eleanor tried to breathe through the tightening in her belly, but the ground seemed to sway beneath her feet. She steadied herself against the post once more, refusing to yield to fear. The sensation passed after several long moments, leaving a thread of cold worry running along her spine. She forced herself to walk, one step and then another, moving away from the station before the night winds rose just as Tawa had warned. The desert stretched wide and silent around her, the heat easing but the loneliness growing heavier with each slow step. She whispered to her unborn child that they would find shelter somewhere, though the words felt desperate and thin in her dry throat. The sky blushed with evening when her vision blurred again. A faint ringing filled her ears. She stumbled, clutching her suitcase, trying to keep her balance. Her body trembled beneath the weight of exhaustion she had tried to hide since morning. She pushed forward a few more steps until the world folded in on itself, the ground rushing up to meet her with unforgiving certainty. Dust rose around her as she sank to her knees, then collapsed fully, cheek pressed to the heated earth. She tried to call for help, but her voice dissolved into the wind. Her last coherent thought was of the beaded charm warm in her palm. Footsteps approached, heavier this time, urgent and unmasked by hesitation. A shadow fell over her, blocking the sun's glare. She forced her eyes open and saw Tawa kneeling beside her, breath uneven as though he had been running. His gaze swept across her face, then lowered to her belly, not with intrusion but with deep, focused concern. Without speaking, he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her with a strength both gentle and absolute. Her head rested against his bare shoulder, his skin warm and solid like a promise she had not earned. He carried her with purposeful strides, the bundle of wood abandoned behind him. The desert wind tugged at his hair, sending loose strands across his cheek. Eleanor tried to speak, tried to insist she could walk, that she was merely tired, but the words caught in her throat. Tawa murmured for her to save her strength. His voice held a calm certainty that quieted her resistance. She let her eyes close, trusting him in a way she had trusted no one in years. When she opened them again, they had reached the outskirts of a small Apache camp, settled in a cradle of low hills. Smoke curled from cookfires, rising like thin ghosts into the evening air. Women glanced up as Tawa approached, their expressions shifting from surprise to recognition to warm acceptance. No questions were thrown like stones. No whispers slithered through the air. Instead, soft hands reached to help as he carried Eleanor toward a shaded shelter near the center of camp. He set her down on a woven blanket, cushioning her gently. One of the older women retrieved a bowl of cool water and pressed it to Eleanor's lips. Another placed a damp cloth against her forehead, humming a low, soothing melody. Two children, little girls with bright, curious eyes, peered in from the entrance, whispering to one another about the white-haired woman brought in by their uncle. Their presence felt like sunlight breaking through cloud cover, warm and harmless. Eleanor tried to rise, embarrassed by the attention, but Tawa rested a hand on her shoulder, urging her to remain still. He crouched beside her, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing the lines of her exhaustion. He told her she had fainted on the road, and the heat could have taken more from her if he had not noticed. She realized then that he must have been watching from a distance, tracking her steps long after he should have continued home. The thought stirred a soft warmth beneath her ribs. The smell of sage drifted through the shelter, as one of the women placed herbs by the fire pit to cleanse the space. Eleanor breathed it in, feeling her lungs loosen. She whispered thanks, but Tawa shook his head gently, as though gratitude had no place between them. He brought a wooden cup filled with a cooled root tea, and guided it to her hands. She sipped slowly, feeling life creep back into her limbs. Hours passed in the quiet hum of evening. Tawa remained near, sitting just outside the shelter, carving a piece of wood with a small bone-handled knife. The rhythmic scrape soothed her, each curl of shaving falling like shed memories at his feet. Eleanor watched him silently, noting the stillness of his posture, the calm of a man who had learned to survive storms by listening to the earth beneath them. The firelight played against his skin, painting soft gold along his arms and jaw. When she finally found the strength to speak, she asked why he had returned for her. Tawa paused, blade hovering above the wood. He said simply that the land whispered when someone was in trouble. He added that he had seen her fall and could not ignore it. His eyes softened with a depth she could not yet decipher. He explained that once, long ago, he had reached for help that never came, and he would not allow another soul to feel that particular quiet grief. His honesty struck her like a stone dropped into deep water. She felt ripples moving through her, stirring pieces she had long kept hidden. She told him she had been traveling to start a new life, though the path had unraveled beneath her feet. She confessed she did not know where she belonged anymore. Tawa listened without speaking, his stillness an invitation rather than a barrier. When she finished, he nodded slowly, as if he saw her whole story laid out like tracks in the sand. The children returned with a small woven basket of berries, and placed it beside Eleanor before scampering off. She smiled for the first time since arriving in this harsh land. Tawa watched that smile with a quiet intensity, like a man witnessing dawn after a long night. He told her she would stay until her strength returned. No demands. No expectations. Only shelter. Night settled fully, stars blooming above the camp in steady, shimmering clusters. Eleanor shifted beneath the blankets, feeling safe in a way she had not expected. Tawa rose, stepping toward the entrance as if to give her rest, but paused when she whispered her thanks once more. He held her gaze for a lingering moment, the fire casting an amber glow across his eyes. Then he spoke words that wrapped around her with the weight of an omen, that when the desert returned someone to the living, it always asked for something in return. His voice carried a caution she did not yet understand, and as a sudden gust of wind extinguished the smaller flames near the doorway, Eleanor sensed that whatever the desert intended for her had only just begun. The dawn rose slowly over the Apache camp, painting faint strokes of apricot light across the silent hills. Eleanor awoke to the soft rustle of canvas, and the murmur of distant voices preparing for the day. Her body felt fragile yet strangely renewed, as though sleep had sewn together some of the seams that had split open along her journey. She sat upright carefully, one hand resting on her belly, listening to the child's faint flutter. A peace she hadn't known in years drifted through her, delicate as morning mist, though the memory of her collapse still clung like dust on her skin. Outside, Tawa knelt by the fire pit, coaxing the embers back to life. The flames flickered against his bare back, casting warm light over the smooth lines of muscle and scar. He didn't turn when she stepped out, yet she sensed he knew she was there. His awareness had a quiet shape to it, the shape of someone who had spent years listening to the world instead of speaking to it. She settled herself on a woven mat nearby, letting the early coolness settle around her. Tawa handed her a clay cup of warmed broth. She accepted it with both hands, the steam rising like a blessing. He said nothing at first. Words between them came softly, as though both feared breaking something fragile. After several sips, Eleanor found the strength to ask whether she had caused trouble by being brought into the camp. Tawa shook his head once, firmly. He told her his people believed the land guided certain lives toward their fire, and those who arrived were meant to be sheltered. His voice held a trace of conviction that warmed her more than the broth. The camp slowly stirred to life. Children played in the dust, giggling as they chased each other around the fire ring. Women ground corn with rhythmic patience. A few men prepared to ride out, nodding respectfully to Eleanor as they passed. Every gesture, every glance, carried acceptance rather than suspicion. She found herself breathing more fully, as though her ribs had loosened. When she tried to help by gathering kindling, Tawa appeared beside her with a quiet insistence that she rest. She protested with a faint smile, saying she was old, not broken. His gaze softened, perhaps amused, but he didn't argue. Instead, he walked with her to a shaded area where the children were painting stones with crushed berries and ash. They welcomed her instantly, handing her a small stone, as if she had belonged to their mornings all along. Eleanor found herself laughing gently at their play, the sound startling her with its ease. Throughout the day, Tawa remained near without hovering. He repaired a shelter roof while keeping her in his periphery. He carved pieces of cedar into shapes meant for ritual. He fetched water from the nearby spring, and left a cup near her without drawing attention to it. Each small gesture braided itself around her heart, pulling tight threads of gratitude and fear. She worried that her presence complicated his life more than he would admit. As the sun climbed higher, Tawa returned with a basket of herbs. He knelt beside her, teaching her the names of each plant in his tongue. She repeated the sounds softly, savoring the unfamiliar cadence. Their fingertips brushed when he handed her a leaf, and a subtle warmth flowed through her arm. She looked down quickly, unsettled by the spark. Tawa's expression remained steady, but something flickered in his eyes, a quiet recognition that unsettled them both. Later in the afternoon, she walked a little farther than she meant to, admiring the pattern of sagebrush along the valley floor. A sudden cramp tightened her belly, forcing her to pause. Before she could call for help, Tawa was already at her side, breath slightly uneven as though he had run to reach her. He steadied her with a careful hand at her back, guiding her toward shade. She whispered that she hadn't meant to worry him. He replied softly that he worried regardless. His words trembled with an honesty that made her chest tighten. That evening, as dusk draped purple shadows across the hills, Eleanor sat before the fire while Tawa braided a small charm from feathers and sinew. His hands worked with almost ceremonial tenderness. He said the charm was for courage, though he didn't specify whose. When he placed it gently into her palm, their fingers lingered in quiet defiance of restraint. A warmth spread through her that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades. Something safe, something steady, something blooming from shared silence rather than hurried promise. But as the fire crackled, guilt rose in her throat like smoke. She told him she could not remain long, that she had already taken too much from his kindness. Tawa's jaw tightened subtly, though his voice stayed gentle. He reminded her that the desert did not send people to their fire without reason. She shook her head, explaining that a younger woman could walk beside him without burden, without the weight of fear and age. Her voice broke slightly when she admitted she did not want to dim the life he deserved. Tawa stared into the fire for a long moment, the flames reflecting in his eyes like questions he did not yet know how to ask. He told her age did not erase a soul's worth. But Eleanor felt the old shame rise again. The shame of being left, of being cast aside, of carrying a child so late that strangers whispered the word miracle with doubt rather than wonder. She feared Tawa saw her through a veil of compassion rather than choice. When she stood to leave the firelight, intending to gather her few belongings quietly, Tawa rose as well. His presence loomed with sorrow more than anger. He stepped toward her, stopping just close enough that she felt the warmth radiating from him. For a heartbeat, she thought he might ask her to stay. Instead he looked away, allowing her decision, though his silence carried a weight that made her knees tremble. She retreated to the shelter where she had been resting, and began to pack the small bundle that held her belongings. The charm he had given her lay on the blanket, its feathers glowing faintly in the firelight. She touched it with trembling fingers, torn between longing and fear. As she tied her bundle closed, a low rumble echoed across the valley. Thunder rolled over the hills, heavy and unbidden, and the scent of incoming rain swept through the air with startling force. Eleanor stepped outside, heart pounding, and saw Tawa standing near the fire pit, stared toward the dark horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance like a torn seam in the sky. The storm was moving quickly, fierce and unyielding. And as the wind lifted her hair and tugged at her clothes, she felt the unmistakable pull of danger rising around her. Danger that cared nothing for age or strength. The storm promised reckoning. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that leaving now might shatter far more than her own fragile hope. The first raindrops fell like cold pinpricks against Eleanor's cheeks as she stepped away from the shelter, bundle clutched in trembling hands. The wind whipped around her, tugging at her white hair, urging her back inside, but she pressed forward anyway, telling herself this was the only way to protect the peaceful life she had stumbled into. The Apache camp had given her more warmth in 2 days than she had tasted in 20 years, and that truth frightened her more than the approaching storm. Her heart pounded beneath her ribs, strained by the weight of shame, gratitude, and something softer she dared not name. She whispered to her unborn child that they must not take more than they deserved. Lightning carved the sky in jagged lines, clashing with the hollow rumble of distant thunder. She felt small beneath its fury, yet she kept walking, each step an echo of every departure she had survived in her life. Behind her, the crackle of the fire pit hissed under the sudden rainfall. She heard hurried footsteps, then Tawa's voice calling her name, roughened by the wind. She stiffened but did not turn. She feared that if she looked at him, if she saw the expression she imagined shadowing his face, she would crumble. The ground trembled with a closer roll of thunder, and the scent of wet earth rose sharply. When his hand finally touched her shoulder, she flinched, not from fear but from a tenderness she had denied herself for too long. Tawa stepped in front of her, rain sliding down his face and bare chest, his breath uneven as though he had sprinted through the storm to reach her before she could disappear into it. For a moment they only stared at each other, the air between them tight and alive, illuminated by flashes of pale fire across the sky. Eleanor tried to speak, to tell him she couldn't stay, but her voice broke before a single word formed. She saw the concern etched deep in his features, the desperate plea he tried to mask behind controlled breaths. The wind howled through the valley, swirling dust and rain into a frenzy around them. Tawa stepped closer, closing the final inches of distance. His eyes held the weight of a man who had buried too many chances, too many loved ones, and could not bear to lose what fate had placed before him now. He said her name again, softer this time, the sound trembling with something unspoken. Lightning illuminated the contours of his face, grief, hope, fear, all braided together in a single raw expression. Eleanor felt her resolve cracking under the force of it. She whispered that she was too old, that he deserved a future unshadowed by burden. The words tasted like iron and regret on her tongue. Tawa shook his head fiercely, rain flinging from his hair. He stepped even closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath despite the storm's chill. He told her she was the strongest woman he had ever seen, that her age was not a weight but a crown earned through surviving every sorrow the world had thrown at her. He said he admired the fire that had carried her across the desert, admired the tenderness with which she protected her unborn child. His voice deepened when he confessed that he had begun to look for her each morning, that her laughter with the children had stitched something inside him that had been torn since the day he lost his wife. She stared at him, stunned, as he admitted that he had not believed he could feel anything again, but her presence had awakened a warmth he thought had been buried with his past. Eleanor's breath hitched, her heart beating wildly. She tried to argue, shaking her head as the storm raged around them, insisting that she could not replace what he had lost. Tawa lifted his hand, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that nearly brought her to her knees. He told her he did not want a replacement, he wanted her. The woman who walked through fire without flinching. The woman who smiled at children as though she carried sunlight behind her eyes. The woman who had endured abandonment and still carried hope inside her body. His thumb brushed a raindrop or a tear from her cheek as he whispered that love did not follow rules set by age or history. It rose where souls recognized each other. Eleanor's chest ached with the magnitude of his words. She felt years of loneliness tremble, struggling to hold their familiar shape. Thunder cracked overhead, startling her, and she pressed a hand to her belly as another sharp tightening swept through her. Tawa saw her grimace and moved instantly, steadying her with strong arms. The wind howled, rain coming harder now in thick, relentless sheets. He urged her back toward the shelter, but she hesitated, torn between the safety he offered and the fear that she was stepping into a future she did not deserve. He sensed her reluctance and tilted her chin upward gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. He repeated, slower this time, that he wanted to build a life with her, that her child was welcome as his own, that the desert had crossed their paths not out of cruelty but mercy. Eleanor felt her last defense melt under the sincerity in his eyes. She nodded, barely, brokenly, and Tawa exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for days. He gathered her in his arms, sheltering her from the storm, guiding her back toward the warm glow of the camp. The fire crackled brighter as they approached, protected beneath the wide overhangs the tribe had constructed against storms. Women hurried toward them with blankets, wrapping Eleanor in warmth. Children stared wide-eyed, whispering excitedly, when they saw Tawa's hand resting protectively against the curve of her belly. The air inside the shelter was thick with heat and relieved murmurs of welcome. Tawa knelt beside her, breath still ragged, and reached for a half-finished cradle carved from cedar that he had hidden away earlier. He placed it gently before her, eyes steady, voice trembling as he said it was meant for the child she carried. Eleanor touched the smooth wood, realizing he had begun shaping this cradle long before he'd spoken his feelings aloud. A soft sob escaped her, half joy, half disbelief, all surrender. Tawa leaned close, forehead nearly touching hers, and promised that she would never walk another storm alone. Outside, the thunder rolled on, but the winds began to soften, as if even the sky recognized the fragile miracle unfolding beneath it. And as Eleanor rested her hand in Tawa's, feeling the steady pulse of a future she had never dared imagine, she understood that the storm had not come to scatter her path. It had come to reveal where she truly belonged.